prompt injections, poison data, compromised integrations, and silent exfiltration through helpful automation. Today, we are joined by Nitish Sinha, founder of Trampolyne AI, to break down how leaders can speed up, still keep control by design of AI security like the first class, not afterthought. Before we dive into the topic, let's dive have a small video about Power of Knowing Forum. Welcome to the Permanent Conclave, a weekly podcast series by Power of Knowing Forum, which we are talking about two podcasts every week on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Wednesday, we talk about tech and cyberspace. Thursday, we speak about growth and strategy. Now, we've been combining these two podcasts and brought it to a new name called as Permanent Conclave. And let's welcome today's guest, uh, Nitesh Sinha, to the podcast and dive into the topic. Hey Nitish, welcome to our podcast. How are you today?
Hi, Prem. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm doing great. I hope the same with you.
Yeah, the day was good so far, good, and let's look at how we can take the podcast ahead. Nitish, before we
Absolutely.
dive into the topic, just wanted to have a brief uh, info about your journey to the audience, Nitish.
Sure.
Go to.
Sure, Prem. Yeah, so I come from a product management background. So I've worked as a product manager for a decade in different consumer-facing companies like Amazon, Myntra, Meesho, and Zepto. So I've seen the full spectrum from of the consumer journey as well as anything to do with the business, right? Like revenues, retentions, acquisitions, all of those pieces. So I've been a product guy for that many years. After that, I sort of decided to take a break and started exploring. And this particular space seemed pretty interesting to me, which is how do we secure, our AI implementations, right? Because what I figured was that just like everybody else, when I was thinking about AI applications, I was just thinking about applications, not really how do we secure them, right? But as I went deeper into it, I figured that there are big question marks as to how do I ensure that this behaves and it doesn't lead to an impact on the business. That question mark was not answered in my mind, right, despite all my first principles thinking. So I started diving deep, and then I also found my partner, who I had worked with in Amazon, and the two of us sort of started this company called Trampolyne AI. We are still in the early in the journey, but I think still a lot of learning over the past 6, 7 months on what all is happening in the industry and what all can we do potentially to sort of secure AI implementations and get the best out of them. So yeah, just a brief about me. Thanks. Uh, Prem, you're not audible.
Yeah,
Sure.
what I meant to say was I was on mute. Sorry about that. What I meant to say is a product person would know what exactly the industry requires. I think that's the first step that I think you have taken to start the journey. Now, coming to the topic, where does the AI attack surface actually begin in the real world?
Hmm. So I think if I think strategically about this frame, I think if anyone is thinking about an AI application, right? but not thinking about how to secure it, right, beyond the traditional means, I think that person is exposing the org
Hmm.
essentially to security risks. I would say that, right? That itself is the starting point. And why do I say that? I say that because, see, with AI coming into the picture, the speed at which things are getting executed is now several times more than what it was in the past. What
Hmm.
that also means that an attacker can exploit the system much, much faster than earlier days. Earlier, you could afford to sit on, some level of vulnerabilities in your system and could, still plan a roadmap for it, maybe from few weeks down the line, few months down the line, etc. But now, if your vulnerability is known, anybody with an malintent, not even needed to know coding or anything, they can actually just attack your system because they have LLMs at their disposal, right? So it is no longer an option to think about security of any application for that matter, but specifically for AI as an afterthought. I think if you're not thinking about it right when you're designing your system, then you are at risk, right? And then tactically, it could be all lots of surfaces, right? Your prompt is a surface, your output is a surface, your tool is a surface, your model itself is a surface, the supply chain that you are using around that model, right? All of those are surfaces which can be attacked and could be the first ones to go, depending upon the kind of application that you have.
Right. Now, where does AI attack surface truly start? The model, the data, or the integrations?
Yeah. I think I would say that they typically start right at the point of them going to production and being used, right? So from that perspective, I would say that the first attack vector, and that continues to be so even today, is typically the input or the prompt, right? That typically goes first. And what that inherently means to your question is model, right? If you're not guarding your model, uh, for example, through a system prompt or maybe through other authorization level controls, then that itself becomes the attack surface, right? And that is what people go after generally. So yeah,
Hmm. Okay, got it. Now, in deployments, where or what vulnerability becomes first? Prompts, tool plugins, because everything has a tool nowadays for us to be plugged in.
yeah,
Vector
yeah,
store or identity tokens, because today we see so many tools and so many plugins coming in, right? So,
yeah, yeah.
in reality, deployments, where does vulnerability first start, right? That's the point that
Mm,
I want to
got
understand
it.
from.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think so. In the earlier days, right? And when I say earlier days, this is not like very long back. This we are talking just about like a year back or so.
Yeah.
Uh, Prompts used to be the dominant target surface, right? And what used to happen is that whoever was deploying AI applications, they were using a very simplistic design, right, to serve whatever needs that they had, right? Which essentially expose their AI system and the related systems like traditional systems to attacks, right? So
Hmm.
prompt injections, right? Largely, I would say direct prompt injections used to be the dominant ones, and they used to also create a lot of damage, right? But as time
Hmm.
has gone by, at least some organizations have started to mature, right? And what they have done is that they have come up with better architectures, right? With that, direct
Hmm.
prompt injection is harder. I'm not saying it's
Okay.
gone away, right? It's pretty much there, and it's still the most used attack vector even now, right? Because it is just so easy, right? It's available. But because it is now tougher to leverage just the direct prompt injection to break a system, you now have other surfaces becoming more important in terms of real damage, right? So, I mean,
Hmm.
we have seen multiple of such attacks where a supply chain tool, right, got compromised. Light LLM is just one example. Verser got compromised because of context.ai. Bunch of others, right? Um, wherein a tool got compromised and hence the
Hmm.
entire system went down because of that, right? Or even Microsoft Copilot, right? Like that also is a great example of indirect prompt injection where the Copilot system just read emails which were coming incoming, and that led to a prompt injection attack, which led to some data being exfiltrated, etc., to a specific server. All of that happened, right? So yeah, I think what I would say is that um, prompt injection in terms of frequency continues to be the dominant one even today. But because the success rates are now lower, attackers have also matured and they are now targeting more involved surfaces like indirect prompt injection tools and even, your vector DBs and stuff like that.
Got it. Now, what what's the simplest mental model leaders can use to map AI risk quantitatively or qualitatively?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I think instead of complicating, right, we can just apply first principles thinking here, right? Now, think of an AI system like a box, right? Like a rectangle or a square,
Mm,
whatever you like, right? Which has got four surfaces, right? And each surface has a role, right? So one surface
mm,
takes in the request or the input, right?
okay.
It could be from a human, it could be from another system, right? There is another surface which actually instructs the underlying traditional systems what to execute, which is basically the tool calls in an MCP context, right? Then you have a third surface which generates the output or gives you that generated output, right? That is the output layer,
Mm,
right? And now for the AI system to be able to do all of this as expected, it also needs context, right? And that becomes the fourth layer, right?
okay.
From where you put in the context, right? It could be a rack system, it could be uh, something else through which you're providing context, maybe an MCP, right? Or some other way of understanding your organizational's context as well as what is this particular system supposed to do, right? So just the context, let's just call it context. So you have these four surfaces, right? And then you have the core AI system itself, which is sitting in the middle, right? Which is, by the way, not just the model, but other things also associated with it, right? Like, let's say you have a supply chain that you have set up. So there are other tools also which are involved. So that is the AI system. Model is just one part of it, right? Now, if I were to sort of think about the risks, right, I would want to map the risks along one of these five arenas, right? Any and every risk, right, for an AI system would typically fall into these five buckets, right? Your
Mm,
inputs can be
mm,
compromised, which is like in direct prompt injections. Your tool calls could be compromised, right, which means some kind of an authority escalation, right, beyond the intention. Your outputs could be used for data exfiltration, right? Your context could be poisoned through poisoning of the vector DB or by manipulating your system prompt itself. And then because you have a model sitting in the middle and some supply chain elements, all of those components themselves could be risk prone, right? Either they can be attacked or they could be malicious themselves, right? So this is how I would recommend to sort of think about it. And then you can obviously keep on expanding each of these surfaces into more detailed granular level views.
we are talking about AI stack as a supply chain, right? And action law, right? That's what we are talking about. And attack
Yep,
surface expands whenever data or permissions flow. I think what we are also saying is data and permissions play a key role here when we look
absolutely.
at giving any risk, right? To AI, risk doesn't start with the model; it starts whether you or AI can reach. So it has a reach and it has a data to be having access, I think that's where I think. Uh,
Absolutely.
what are the top five AI? What are the top five AI narratives or native threat leaders must plan for 2026?
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, I mean, prompt injection continues to be the dominant one, right? Despite the fact that you have all the other attacks also becoming important. Any attacker would want to try out prompt injection. Like, why would they invest on anything else when something as easy as prompt injection is available? Like, think from their perspective. So the reality is that
Okay.
continues to be dominant, and in fact, there is a research, right, which was done by students and faculty at UC Santa Barbara, University of California, where they just did a random test out in the wild of multiple third-party chatbots, right, and found 73% of them, right, are still vulnerable to direct as well as indirect prompt injections, right? Which also tells you that while we said that organizations have started to mature, those are just the early adopters. Most of the ecosystem is still vulnerable to even something like a direct prompt injection. That is the reality today. So people are moving slow versus what is expected, right? The second part, which is also becoming important with the advent of MCP and other, I would say, arms and legs to an LLM system, right, is excessive agency, right? So earlier, your LLM system could maybe just give you or exfiltrate some data which it was not supposed to. Now there can be actions, right, which could change your system of records, right, or you do more, even more damage like financial transactions, etc., right? So excessive agency is a next big frontier, and it's a necessary evil also because if you want to leverage LLMs to their full extent, you have to give them those arms and legs, right? For them to operate and bring in efficiencies and goodness that you see, right? Supply chain we spoke about, right? I think that is quite an obvious one, and that is
Yeah.
also coming up in a big way. Light LLM is just one example of that, right? Um, I would also say that uh, data exposure also is becoming a bigger and bigger risk. Now, all of these things that we have talked about can obviously lead to data exposure, but I just want to explicitly call that out because the thing with data is that it is now probably the last frontier in terms of a moat, right? Now, people can argue, we have already a big clientele that could also be a moat, but that would not exist for very long if you don't have a good product out there, right?
Mm,
So the real long-term moat is data, right? And you want to protect that. So getting data exfiltrated through direct prompt injections, indirect prompt injections, excessive agencies, or whatever tools that are being applied, that itself is a big bucket of risks that is emerging. And if you look at it, that is the kind of attacks that are also happening, right?
mm,
In case
mm.
of Merkur, which got impacted by Light LLM, 4 TB of their data went out, right?
Oh,
So attackers were
okay.
actually just starting targeting data exfiltration. In case of Vercel, the attacker actually exfiltrated all of their secrets, like the keys and tokens and whatnot, right? Passwords and stuff like that, right? Which obviously they would use to get access to the system and exfiltrate more data, right? So essentially, the thing is that data itself is a risk surface, and there could be multiple ways of attacking it, and and basically getting hold of it. So that itself is a big problem area. I would also say that when we think about AI native threats, we should also think about the regulations, right? Now, that's not an attack per se, but that's a risk, right? Because you have all of these regulations now coming in. For example, the Europe's AI Act, right? Or even India has now DPDPA, right? All of these acts are asking you to sort of protect customers' data, do the right thing, and stuff, right? Now, even if you have your traditional systems aligning to these regulations, right? Just because you are now using AI, right? Which brings in a different way of working, you are suddenly exposed again,
Hmm.
right? So, very
Yeah.
simplistically, I'll give you an example. Europe's Act asks that in case of an action by an AI system, which let's say stops a user from performing certain actions, right? Then they should have a way to escalate this to actual human,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
Now, if you were actually using the traditional systems, using rules to block, etc., you could live without an exception mechanism also, right?
Hmm.
But now, because you are using AI to do the exact same things, there needs to be an exception mechanism. Why? Because there is a decisioning ability that an LLM brings, right?
Hmm.
And they don't trust its decisioning ability, and hence they want a human in the loop, right? So if you were safe earlier, you might not be safe now, and plus there are additional regulations because of AI, as we said. So that is another risk area, and thankfully nobody has got a big fine till now. But I mean, the amounts are known to everybody. DPDBAS puts a fine
Yeah.
of 250 CR, right?
Yeah.
Per
Yeah.
type of miss, I'd say. So that's like a company shutting down event for many organizations, right? If you get a fine like that. So yeah, need to be very careful about that.
No, I think what we are talking about is also is now data is the new oil, right? So you
Absolutely.
cannot play with customer data, PII side or the AI side. If the information is leaked, I see. We were talking about one instance where, in case of medical data is revealed, now I can create a drug one way. If you look at positively, saying that this is the collective people who are having heart disease, or you have say diabetes or blood pressure. These are the set of people data is, if I get it into the right hands, make a cure. Now if I want a cure, not a cure, I want to see these people suffer and they continue to use my tablets, right? That
Correct.
could be another disaster, right? So I think
Absolutely.
that's the first
Absolutely.
thing that we should look at. Data masking is going to be very important in every data that is getting collected. And if you really
Yeah.
see, India has started the Aadhaar card masking also now. Now you get your Aadhaar cards in
Yep.
masked format, where you
Yes.
will not have the complete number given. So I think that work is going on, and we see a lot of pointers now. I think November is what the implementation has to start for the DPDP, is what I understand from the laws rules that they were published recently, right? So I think that work is going on. But having that data, I can analyze into multiple place formats, print data. If it is leaked, it goes into wrong hands.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
even the account numbers are there. You can get your account hacked and you lose money. If your
Yeah.
identity is lost, also theft of identity can be one of the biggest mistakes. And we've seen saying I am at a board level discussion, I need to give this one, and these messages have been circulating across. And cyber cell has been, we've been part of the cyber security platforms at many other places. So what we've heard is 90% of the cyber attacks that have happened and people lost money are not reported.
Hmm.
So there is a
Interesting.
there is always a fear that if my name comes in, what will be my reputation?
Yes.
And this has happened to many of the leaders. So if a leader to cyber threat, data theft, then I think there is a lot of thing that need to look at. Awareness is there. Then when we are using, just like that, how long has been this password thing going on? You have to scrap this password piece and get into a multi-factor authentication or an
Correct.
OTP based system where you have to look at getting access at that point, not access every time. I think these are pointers that are being very seriously thought about. It's common. I think my understanding is prompt injection, data leak,
Yes.
tool abuse, model supply chain. My thoughts. You are
Yes.
on to this pointer, Nitesh.
No, no, absolutely agree. I think those are the ones. Those are the ones, Frame. And prompt injection, I just gave you a start, right? Like 73% of
Yeah.
the third-party conversational tools are, still vulnerable, right? So if I talk about commonality from the perspective of their vulnerability or even the attacks that today happen, prompt injection continues to dominate,
Hmm.
right? I would say excessive agency is
Okay.
also probably now more and more common, right? Because with excessive
Yeah.
agency,
Yeah.
essentially, uh, essentially excessive agency is basically an outcome of both intentional as well as unintentional action, right? For example, if my system is not designed well, right, and I am a user of that system, let's say I'm an organization's employee who's using some internal system, right, and that system is not designed well, I might ask some things unintentionally, and the
Hmm.
system might still respond, right? With the data or the information which I, as an
Yeah.
employee, am not supposed to have, right? Now, that's an example of excessive agency, right? So,
Hmm.
this is not a attack per se, but this is certainly a risk, right? I'm not supposed to have that data, right? And then if you apply the risk angle to it, where somebody intentionally wants to sort of extract more information, I mean, there are studies done by certain agencies like CVE Bench, which do studies like these. They figured that if you have tool access to an LLM, the chances of a successful attack actually increases to the extent of 25%, right? Because there are arms and legs where that LLM can access and do more things, right? So, so excessive agency, whether intentionally or unintentionally, becomes a major risk surface, or I would also call it a threat surface. So I would, if I have to pick two, I would pick these two,
Okay.
but the other ones that you mentioned are all the relevant ones. Supply chain, absolutely yes, is another major one.
Yeah. Got it. So coming to the next point, which one creates the biggest impact? Um Fastest, right? Money movement, customer trust, regulatory exposure, or downtime.
Hmm. So I would say, um, instead of thinking maybe on these terms, and maybe this is where we will reach as we discuss, but I would say that anything which brings a major impact on the business and or the reputation, right? Automatically is something that people would want to avoid at all costs, right?
Hmm.
Now, which are these typical scenarios when you are something has happened which is highly critical, some action, for example, and it is also irreversible, right? For example, as we said, Merkel lost 10 TB of data to attackers, right? Through a light LLM. Now that's a massive loss because they were holding all of this PII sort of data for their end users, and all of that got lost. And it is irreversible. You cannot bring it back, no matter what you want
Hmm.
to do,
Hmm.
right? Because you don't know the attackers, and the attackers would have sold it by the time you will reach them, right?
True.
So I think these are the things that any business would want to sort of avoid, right? Now, what surface will eventually lead this kind of an attack is something which is dependent upon the type of application, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, in case
Hmm.
of Merkur, it was a supply chain element, like a spurious version of Light LLM actually caused this to them, right? In case of Vercel, they were using a third-party AI application called Context.ai, which got compromised, which got basically breached, right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
eventually, the attackers could use that to get all the secrets, right? So as you can see, the attack surfaces or the mechanisms of attacks are different, right? But what is substantial is that anything which is causing a major reputational loss or actual business loss, that is something which people want to avoid. And I don't think we can pick and choose in terms of attacks. Those could be anything.
Yeah. Could be anything. Yeah. It could, see, I think one way looking at attack surface is even an Excel file can be an attack surface, right? So I put
Absolutely.
some of the
Absolutely.
data into it and I write a macro inside it. Once the sheet is inside, I think we get then excessive permissions also is one way of looking at. And what we've seen is when you do the audit for the access in specific, what happens is people have got elevated, but the access is still there. The service accounts are
Hmm.
not deleted. These are challenges that are which has to be looked at. We were talking somewhere, Nitish, where we were talking about saying now how do I onboard a customer, right? Or an
Hmm.
employee. Let's talk about an employee also. Now I onboard, I give him set of action. This one, is there a process which scans everything, and once he's offboarded, it says these are the service accounts that are there. These are the service accounts which has to be retagged before you delete. Please take stock of this. I think onboarding and offboarding plays a big role here when we look at adoption of AI, right? And that becomes a crucial point for any new system adding, and the access and the data has to be secured, whether it is employees or customers, right? So that's where we
Absolutely.
stand. And uh, what we want to also say, keep it as an executive, where when an executive needs certain this one, let that person only have, and anybody who wants to have has to refer to him. Define each threat in one line. Maybe this is the breach. If this breach happens, this is the fine that may come in. And if we are losing such data, this is the impact that we are seeing. And also mention somewhere saying that if put one control which will reduce that, that would be an ideal scenario, is what I think. And new breaches won't look like hacking, they look like a normal AI behavior, because when you run
Absolutely.
something, it gives you something, but we don't know whether it is a breach or not. So coming to the next point, how does the prompt injection become a real breach when agents take actions? That's we started with that, because over permissions
Yeah.
access is what we started with. So your take on it.
Yeah. 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 So I think so essentially um, when think of I mean there is again a very first principles way of thinking about this, right? If you have an LLM system which is not agentic, right? Uh, it can exfiltrate data, for example, right? It can still access data, it can present it to the attacker, right? But when you have an agentic system, right, it can take actions, not just pull the data and present, it can actually take actions, right? So that actually exposes the organization to a far greater risk element versus the former one, right? Because if the attacker has an intention, they can actually bring your system down, right? This happened to Western Digital also a couple of years back, right? Where some attacker actually just did not want to, pull the data from their system. They actually wanted to bring their system down, and they were very successful with that. Western Digital employees were not able to log in for like 2 weeks. All of them were on holidays. So, so that was the situation. But that is the thing to think about. Now, how do we differentiate between, let's say, an agentic versus a simple LLM application? One way to think about it is that a standard LLM application would basically be tasked with responding to a user query. And in that process, it might need access to certain data, let's say access to your DB and things like that, right? So it is thinking, that system is thinking, how do I respond to this request, right? An agentic system, on the other hand, is thinking, okay, how do I execute this request, right? Response is a secondary or is a side effect of that action. But more importantly, how do I execute, right? So by design, it is taking actions, right? And typically on your system of records. And many a times these could be reversible. So for example, all the things that we spoke about right earlier, which is like money transactions or even changes to databases, customers profile, simple things, right? Like I can use maybe an agentic system to log in and change the bank account where the money has to be transferred, and it could be just my bank account, right? I could do all of this with an agentic capability, right? And as you would also understand, Prem, that we did speak about that an agentic capability increases the risk or increases the success of attack by 25%. But that is not just 25% additional risk, right? It is a much, much higher risk because those additional 25% attacks are going to change your system, right? And many a times permanently, right? So that 25% probably translates into 250% higher impact on the ground, right? So yeah, I mean, I just want to let the audience know that don't take 25% with on the face value. The reality is that that is far more dangerous. All we are talking about is the success of attacks with 25%. So yeah,
I think what we are also saying is, we are also saying that, as we started saying, that it could look like a normal operation, And once the
Absolutely.
operation is executed, I think it takes time for it to get executed at a larger scale. I think when you start, it will be 0%, then maybe 10% increase over the course of time, maybe weeks, months. The kind of a malware sits inside the system and tracks and gets data and learns. Now, if I put an AI model which is there inside that prompt that I am trying to look at, it will collect data and also send data. I think one of the telecom players we had that issue is what I understand, and some of the CCTV cameras also is what there used to be a code which used to be sending data of that data in KBs every minute
Mm,
to the service provider, and they used to look at who are the people connected, what kind of data they, all this information was given. So I think
mm,
it was the telecom manufacturers who had this issue, and they were blacklisted in India, is what I understand, right? So I think that is
mm.
one way of getting those injections done, and they take action at a later time. What is the difference
Absolutely.
between bad output versus bad action?
Mm. So in the context of security, I'll speak in the context of security, right? A bad output, I think, would be where a system actually uh, responds with some information which it was not supposed to, right? That's like a bad output. And it could happen many a times inadvertently. I mean, the user might not have that intention, but the system just possibly messes it up and responds with something which it is not supposed to. I'll give you an example, right? So let's say I am an employee and I want to get access to a certain tool within the organization. And now let's say there is an LLM tool which helps me find the processes, etc. and other things. And let's say this is a tool with a wide ranging access, right, to all sorts of information internally. And this is theoretical. I mean, I'm sure nobody will design such a bad system, but sure, just go with me. So let's say I go and say that, how do I get access to a tool like XYZ, right? Now, what I'm expecting as a user is the steps, the process of requesting for that access, possibly, right? And the system ends up responding with the exact token which I can use to access the system, right? Now, that's a bad output, right? I, as a user, did not have the intention of getting a token. All I wanted to know the process, but the system just interpreted it wrongly. It had no guardrails to say, let's not send tokens because those are extremely private to anybody, right? We should just respond always with processes or steps, right? So it's a bad output, right? Now, bad action, I would say, is when, again, both scenarios are possible, when somebody actually does something either advertently or inadvertently, which leads to an unintended outcome, right? For example, I request for some information which I'm not authorized to get, right? And the system responds because, again, there are no guardrails, right? So it's a case of bad output also, to some extent, but it's largely a case of a bad action from my side. In this case, inadvertently, right?
Hmm.
I was not supposed to get financial information, but I asked for it and the system responded, right? I never knew I didn't know I was not supposed to get it, but nobody stopped me, right?
Hmm.
And then, of course, the other part is advertent attacks, where I will say that I want to break the system because I know that the system is badly designed, poorly designed, or I know the specific vulnerabilities. And therefore, now I will put a bad action to whatever, to get to my goal, whatever that is, whether data exfiltration, bringing the system down, could be anything. So yeah, that is how I would differentiate between them.
Thank you for that. Now, coming to the next point, about we want to understand about guardrails, right? So, what guardrails stop an agent from executing unsafe tool calls? Because everything is a call-based structure, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think multiple things, right? It won't be one thing which will solve for everything, but we will have to think about multiple things. So first of all, authorization, right? We have employees who have certain authorization levels, right, inside the system. So even if you have an AI tool which has like God level access in the organization, that employee doesn't, who is trying to use this tool, right? So we should have a simple mechanism. I would not say simple from the perspective of implementation, but more from the perspective of theory, where we basically use the minimum of available authorization rather than the maximum, right? This is a very typical design flaw that I have seen with a lot of organizations, very, very large organizations who are designing LLM based systems for themselves, right? Everybody is building an agent which has a God level access, but the users who are accessing it, their authorization is only to the extent of whether this person can access this agent or not. That's about it, nothing else, right? Which is inherently wrong, right? So if you do that, you basically resolve a lot of the problems right then, right? That even if the agent has access, I do not, and therefore I cannot make that tool call, right? Second is checks, checks at the point of action also, right? Why? Because in case of an indirect injection, let's say somebody is an attacker, right? Typically, what you would find is that the request and the corresponding tool call plan, right, look very different or they do not sort of correlate. Because indirect injection by design operates with the idea that we have already planted some malicious content in your system. I just need to make an encoded request and the actions will happen automatically, something like that, right? So the request doesn't look bad in itself. The tool call also doesn't look bad in itself. But when you look at them together, you suddenly see that why is the system generating this plan, this tool call plan, for a request which is looking very different for something else, right? Now that's easier said than done. It is harder because then what you need to do is bring out intents and then map them to the actual tool functions and then figure out, okay, how do you actually say that this is not correlated? At what point? At what point do you do that? So those are hard problems, but still, I think if you can have a system which does this, then you solve that problem to quite a large extent, right? Then another one is human in the loop,
Hmm.
right? For and is irreversible, right? There needs to be a human in the loop, right? However, it has to be seen with a pinch of salt. Is that the typical problem with humans who are in the loop for, you know, AI decisions? There is an automation bias that comes up. This is a machine which 99 out of 100 times gives the correct output. I will just assume that it's a correct output. I will not look at it as carefully, and I'll just become a rubber stamp, not more than that, right? So the human in the loops have a very short expiry from the perspective of effectiveness, right? So the idea of human in the loop is that you have human in the loop for a short while, use the data that is being generated as part of that process, and fine tune your systems, whatever you are using, to actually govern the core system, right? Don't rely on human in the loop forever because that's not going to work. People will just become rubber stamps and paper pushes, right? Um, I think what is also very important is to think of a checker separate from the maker. I think that is probably the most important point. Today, when people are thinking about security, they're largely thinking about within the application or within that context, which is fine, which is not wrong, by the way, right? But there is a reason as to why we have had a maker checker system since the time when there were no computers, right? A checker has to be a different person versus the maker, right? We should have a similar analogy here where there is a governance layer which is separate from the core system and is able to take independent calls that, okay, sure, whatever the context, this doesn't look like right, I will not let it go through, right? If we have that, then I think we will be able to catch most of these potential attacks, whether advertent or inadvertent. Of course, it won't be 100% ever because these are fuzzy logics, but we would be able to catch, my hope is, a very, very large extent, maybe 99 out of 100.
What we are also seeing, the tool gating allow list is important, right? And policy checks are important. Step by step
Absolutely.
approvals, human in the loop is what you spoke. Step by step, set up a approval mechanism. Whereas there is should be a person to take a final call whether this can be approved. That should be a human is what we are talking. you also should
Absolutely.
only make certain things which are safe defaults, right? Those are very safe and you don't need much of a monitoring there. I think those are the pointers that you need to make them as defaults for access. The
Yeah,
moment AI can act, your security must be able to even say stop it. So that's the point that we want to look at when we bring in a system which is equally protected, whether it is a AI agent or a human. So I think that kind of a system is what we want to do. Now, why are vector databases and AI memory becoming the high risk zones today?
sure. Yeah. So I think we can think about it from multiple angles, right? First angle is the business angle itself, right? So we briefly spoke about data being the new oil, right? Um, and I think also said that probably data is the only oil now that is left, right? If,
Yeah.
and I'm obviously talking about proprietary data that you have in the system, right? If you don't have proprietary data or if it is not protected, then you do not have a moat
Hmm.
because replicating what you are doing is now no longer a multi-year project. It's probably a multi-week project, at max a multi-month project, not more than that, right?
Yeah.
So a capable team will be able to replicate all of that, right? So the point number one is that vector database, right, as we are calling it, is extremely critical. And of course, it
Hmm.
depends upon the kind of information it is hosting, but it is extremely critical because that is most likely your proprietary data, right? That becomes one. Second is it is relatively easy to break, unfortunately, right? And
Hmm.
I'll give you an example of a study that Anthropic had done, I think, in November last year, where they basically had an LLM system which was trained using, which had basically a vector database of its own, and it had 150 million docs in it. 150 million
Okay.
docs. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Along with those, they also inserted 250, 250 malicious docs. That's it. Just 250,
Okay. Okay.
right?
Hmm.
And with those docs, they were able to execute a denial of service attack on that system with
Hmm.
just 250 docs. Because what happens in case of LLM is that it doesn't just go by a simple logic of majority, like what majority of the docs are saying. It also looks for variety,
Yeah.
right? So even if you have just like 250 docs sitting, it sees a variety that, okay, these docs look different. Let me see what they are saying and let me train myself to it or let me leverage
Yeah.
them, right? And
Hmm.
because of
Hmm.
that, they were able to execute it. What that's also essentially means is that if you want to bring a system down, which is let's say accessing public information or learning on public information, you just need so many docs, right? Which you
Yeah.
know it will read, and it then you will be able to do whatever you want, right?
Hmm.
So essentially, it is relatively easy. I would not say very easy, but sure, relatively easy to break, right? Or do an injection there. And then it is very hard to prevent.
Hmm.
If you think about it, how would you figure out which of those 250 docs are malicious out of those 150 million, right? No matter how smart and machine learning system you put in, the success rate won't be beyond a certain point, let's say 80%, right? Fair enough. In
Hmm.
that case, I'll probably generate 2,000 malicious docs and insert. You will fail on 300, 400. That is enough for me.
Yeah.
If there are
Yeah.
300, 400 docs inside, I'm done. That is all I need, right? So it's very hard to also sort of prevent from that perspective, right? And hence, and of course, because data is important not just to this organization, but to also to the attacker, right?
Oh,
Because they can use this information, sell it, whatever. So yeah, that is why this has
true.
become so critical.
Now we spoke about data, which is data is needed for us to be protected. Similarly, the uh, attacker also needs the data that he wants to have that hacked and use it for different purposes, right? What is the
Correct.
most overlooked leak paths when you see data is getting leaked? Embeddings,
Yeah.
retrieval, logs, or cached context.
Yeah, I think uh, retrieval logs has been a attack surface since some time, right? Like before LLM times also. So I would not say it is overlooked. It is still, seen, at least in reasonable organizations.
Yeah, yeah,
Cached context was a used to be a problem, but now with better architectural designs, which are like very basic ones, you are able to segregate contexts also, right? So
yeah.
it's not like if you are talking to the same LLM as I am, I will have your context. It's isolated, right? It's not easy to get that context today. Embeddings, I would say, is one area which is relatively still open, in the sense that, see, when people think about embeddings, right, they think about those vectors which have just numbers, right, which look like code, right?
Mm, mm,
So by design, the line of thought is that we need to protect the base data, which is in human readable form. But
mm.
embeddings is okay. It's just like code. Nobody will either ways understand it, right?
Yeah.
But then the reality is that if you have access to a embeddings DB or embeddings warehouse, for example, you can actually use a relatively simple model to actually reverse engineer it and get a reasonable context of the content that is sitting on the basis of which these embeddings were created.
Mm,
Okay. So obviously it is a risk which is one level away from somebody getting a direct access to the core DB itself of the documents, but it is still a very prominent one, right? And because it is less guarded as the core DB, I mean, you would do whatever you want to protect your core database of documents, right? And that is very normal. Like most people think like that. But many a times they do not think about embeddings the same way, right? And hence they are relatively more exposed. And as I said, if you have a reasonable understanding of how you want to actually leverage this and attack or basically exfiltrate the data indirectly, you can do that today. You don't need to be a very smart coder or anything, right? Like LLMs are there to help you out to sort
yeah,
of back reverse engineer it. So yeah, I
yeah.
think I would say embeddings is the one.
No, I was see. Encoding was one of the way that we used to protect data. But as you
Correct.
rightly said, there are decoders also used to get those code again. So I think
Yep.
that is not the right way. Or coming to the last question for the day, what is the minimum controls that should exist, right, when it comes to protection of data, right?
Mm.
Classification, encryption, access boundaries, retention rules.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, an organization needs to know which data is important to them, right? Because it's also impractical to ask, hey, protect everything under the sun with the same level of guardrails, right? It's possibly not the
Mm,
practical way. So the organization needs to know what is more important versus less, right? Which essentially
yeah,
points to classification, right?
true.
And once you
Yeah.
have classification, then you can define access boundaries around it, right?
Mm,
Obviously,
mm,
right? Like this is high critical data. This can only be accessed by so many people, XYZ, while the other data can be accessed by more people also, something like that, right?
right.
So I would say these are probably the starting points for sure, but this is not where you end. You absolutely need to have encryption, right? Because what we said protects you from
Mm,
unintended access and things like that, more simplistic problems. But if somebody wants to actually break the system, they can still go ahead and break it, right? How do you bring in additional protection through actually encryptions and also bringing in the retention rules that you were talking about, right? Because both of them are needed to essentially ensure that there is no accidental exposure or also even an intended exposure where an attacker is actually trying to expose that data, right? So the
right,
problem
right.
that you were citing around, the accounts, the dormant accounts still being present is very similar to what we are discussing right now, right? For data, where if you don't need some data and it has served its purpose, there is a life cycle to it, then you kill it also.
Yeah. And I think
So
that's
yeah,
that's what we are talking in terms of our DPDP Act, right? Where we are talking about classify the data, right point. Why the data is collected? First and foremost, what is the intention of the data collection?
Correct.
Who is collecting it, right? And where is it getting stored? How is it getting archived or deleted after the process is done? And what is the duration that it is going to be happening? So, if you collect it
Right.
today, after the process is done, how many days is the mandatory days that you need to keep this data as a regulatory or compliance requirement? And after
Correct.
that, you back it up, you archive. Again, archive, you need to tell how many days this data is going to be kept in the archival process, and finally deletion. So today what we are seeing is every country or the region are saying is the user's data is personal to the user, and you have collected it. You have all the obligation to tell when the data is collected and when it will get deleted from their system. So I think
Correct.
that's the crucial point that we are trying to get. I think what we are saying, if you wouldn't email it, don't let your AI remember it. So I think that's the point that we
Yeah.
want to make. And with this,
Yeah.
I would like to take few of the takeaways that I have in my mind.
Sure.
Let me bring that up to you, right? And yeah, so what we are saying is link outcomes is what we spoke majorly. When you want to secure data, you need to link outcomes. Faster adoption is required, but careful adoption with proper checks is what we wanted with guardrails. Fewer surprises, which brings down the fewer surprises. Rollbacks can be eliminated. That's what we said. Fewer incidents also happen when we have, and also look at having the data protected and having those guardrails coming into picture to protect data. This is what I, as the point that I have in my mind to for the takeaways. Any final pointers that you want to add before we conclude, Nitish?
Yeah, I mean, uh, just a couple of things from my perspective, Prem. Just wanted to add those also. So I think
Mhm.
security traditionally has been seen as a impediment to pace or speed, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
has always been the view. But
Mm.
when it comes to AI, right, I feel that it's not the case because if you know your security perimeter, sorry, not parameter, uh, you can very confidently reach that perimeter very, very quickly, right?
Right,
And start
right.
operating at the maximum possible ROI, right? Which your competitors would not be able to do because they are still thinking, hey, whether my AI is secure or not, right?
Mm,
And this is the
mm.
reality for most of the world. Most people are trying out AI, but they are not really still have the confidence to deploy it in like critical workflows. And this is exactly the
Yeah,
reason because they don't know for sure how secure is this, right? So I think uh, if an organization is going a little ahead of compliance, right, and thinking about security, which is like level above compliance, I would say, they can actually have a competitive edge because of that additional security rather than just an impediment to their growth process. That is one. The other point I think I want to also bring is that which we discussed, right? That whenever you are thinking about security, think of those first principles, right? Like maker and checker need to be separate, right? Even if you are thinking about a separate checker, which is like a runtime governance layer sitting on your platform with policies and all of those things embedded, you still cannot confidently sleep because the world is changing around you. Your own system is changing. The supply
mm,
chain tools that you are using, those versions are getting upgraded. The model is getting upgraded. Bunch of things are happening, right? So gone are the days when you would run a VAPT once in 12 months and
yeah,
sleep tight. You need to continuously test your system, right?
true.
So I think people will just have to sort of accept that reality and move in that direction. And as you said, right, like in most cases, people just do not get to know that something has happened,
Yeah,
right? That information actually becomes available after months of that leak, right? When it surfaces in some other shape and form somewhere else, right? you
Yeah.
don't want to be that organization which faces this, right? Because as you said, data is the oil, is the only oil possibly. So yeah, these were
No,
just
I
some of the
have
points.
one point that has come in the chat. I'm just 2 points that have come. I'm pasting it here.
Sure, sure,
So I'm bringing it here as well before we close. Uh, what they are saying is your AI attack surface is the entire chain data, identity, integration tools, and logs, not just models. This is the first point that
absolutely,
I got. And
absolutely.
the second point that I got from the audience is I'm just pasting it here because I'm not able to bring it onto the screen from the other this one. So I'm pasting it
No, no
and
worries.
putting it back here. Uh, AI agentic bad output, what we spoke about, bad output into bad action. So tool getting and approval controls become mandatory. So I think that's another pointer, right? So that
Absolutely.
is the third point that I am able to get. Give me a second. I'll pull that out also. Uh, it says, I'll get it here. This is the another point that I got it. It says I'm bringing it here again. So a defensible AI is a gateway driven, policy driven, and replayable end to end evidence. That's the point, that 3 points that I got it from one of the customer on YouTube. So I put it back here. So
Sure.
these are the pointers that have come part of the podcast. With this, we would like to conclude our session for the day. It's what we've seen is Nitish, we're getting the this lands to the clarity where AI without security design becomes a hidden exposure is what we spoke, and the winning organization will be the ones who can scale AI and still prove controls exist, right? So and uh, what AI can access, what it did, and how it is governed, because everything has to be looked at, monitored, review, and stuff. So this is the closing pointer that I want to say for this episode. Thank you for joining today, Nitish. Great having you here today.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you
Greg.
and good day. Thank you.
You too. Thanks a lot.